August 1883, Gila Bend, Arizona Territory. The train hissed to a stop in the dead heat of noon, steam curling up into the clear desert sky. Bria Sullivan stepped down with her gloved hands tight around the handle of a worn carpetbag, dust already clinging to the hem of her gray traveling dress. Her pale blue eyes scanned the platform, but there was no one waiting, just a broken sign that read Gila Bend, nailed crooked on a sun-bleached post and a wide stretch of nothing beyond it. She had expected a town, a real one, a place with people, a church, a general store, anything. Instead, what stood before her looked more like a graveyard than a town. A dozen buildings, most with their windows boarded or broken. A saloon with its doors hanging off their hinges. The post office sagged like it was tired of standing. Bria swallowed hard. She had answered the ad in the Denver Gazette 4 months ago, written by a man named Thomas R. Lane, who claimed to be a cattleman in need of a wife. His letters had been short but kind, promising a house, a fresh start, and respect. She had nothing left in Colorado, no family, no safety, just a name and a ticket. But there was no Thomas Lane here. She crossed the street, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust as she walked toward the saloon. The door creaked open and she stepped inside. It smelled like old whiskey and dried wood. The only sound came from a man asleep in the corner, his hat pulled down over his face and a bottle cradled in his arms. Bria turned and walked back out. She stood in the street, sun beating down, and for the first time in months, fear clawed at her chest. "You waiting for someone?" a voice called behind her. She spun around. A tall man stood beside the livery stable, sleeves rolled up, his shirt stained with red dust and sweat. He had a square jaw hidden beneath a few days' worth of beard and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over sharp, steady eyes. "I am," Bria said. "A man named Thomas Lane. I am his bride." The man's stare didn't waver. "No one by that name around here. Not in years." Bria felt her knees weaken. "He wrote me letters. Sent for me." He nodded slowly like he had seen this sort of thing before. "Then I reckon he lied." Her throat tightened. "Is there a place I can stay?" He looked around, then back at her. "Not rightly. Most folks left after the mine dried up." Bria felt her last thread of hope slip. "Then what do I do?" The man walked closer, his boots crunching in the sand. "Name's Harlan Osner. I work a claim east of here. Silver mostly, though it's lean." He paused, eyeing her carefully. "You got nowhere else?" "No," she whispered. He let that settle, running a hand through his dark hair. "I got a shack near the mine. Nothing fancy. 1 room, cot, stove. You can stay there." Safer than sleeping in this ghost town. Bria hesitated. "Why help me?" Harlan's jaw tightened, but he spoke soft. "Because you got dropped in the middle of nowhere with no lies of your own. That deserves better than being left to rot." She studied him. His voice was rough but not unkind. His eyes, though hard, were not cruel. "All right," she said finally. He nodded once. "Get your things." The desert stretched wide as they rode out, Bria perched behind Harlan on a tired-looking mule. The sun dipped low, turning the sky orange and casting long shadows over the rocks. They rode in silence, except for the wind and the occasional call of a hawk. When they reached the shack, it was just as he had said: rough wood, a slanted roof, a stove in the corner, and a cot against the wall. But it was clean. There was a tin basin with water, a folded blanket, and a small stack of firewood. "You can sleep here," he said, setting her bag down. "I'll take the lean-to." "You do not have to." "I do," he said, and walked back outside. Bria sat down on the cot, her hands shaking. Everything was gone, her plans, her promise of a new life, but this man, this stranger, had not turned her away. That night, she lay awake, listening to the wind whistle through the cracks in the walls. Harlan did not say much the next morning either. He boiled coffee, handed her a cup, and rode out to the mine with a pickaxe over his shoulder. Days passed. He returned each evening with dirt on his boots and sweat on his brow. Bria mended one of his shirts without asking. He brought her a rabbit he had snared. She cooked it over the stove and they ate in silence. Slowly, the silence became less heavy. One evening, as the sky turned deep purple, Bria stood outside the shack, arms wrapped around herself. Harlan came up behind her, quiet as ever. "You miss home?" he asked. "I do not know where that is anymore," Bria said. He nodded. "I used to think that too." She glanced at him. "What changed?" He looked toward the hills. "Stopped waiting for someone to fix it. Started building something instead." Bria looked away. "I came here to be someone's wife. That is all I was supposed to be." "You still can be," he said quietly. "But maybe not the way you expected." She turned toward him slowly. "Why do you care?" He met her gaze. "Because every day I see you try. You do not complain. You do not quit. You deserve more than being lied to and forgotten." Her breath caught. The sun lit his face in gold and shadow. She felt something shift in her chest, something warm, something real. The next morning, Bria woke early. She swept the floor, boiled coffee, and waited. When Harlan returned from the mine, he looked at the shack and paused. She had built a small shelf for his tools. Cleaned his boots. She handed him a cup without a word. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he took the cup, their fingers brushing. "Thank you," he said. Bria smiled. "You are welcome." They sat outside that night, watching the stars come out one by one. He passed her a blanket when the wind got cold. She leaned into it. He did not move away. Something was building between them, not fast, not loud but steady. Like the desert. Like the way he looked at her when she was not watching. And though she had arrived in a ghost town with nothing but disappointment, Bria began to feel something she had not felt in a long time. Hope. The wind came in low from the east, dry and restless, stirring grit across the clearing outside the shack. Bria had taken to rising before the light bled over the mountains, slipping out to gather kindling and check the traps Harlan had set along the arroyos. She moved slower than she once had, not from weakness, but from care. Each step had purpose now. She found a jackrabbit twisted in the wire near the base of a mesquite tree. Blood darkened its fur where the snare had closed. She crouched, jaw tight, and freed it with a practiced hand. She didn't flinch anymore. When she returned, Harlan was already back from the ridge, a dented pail of or slung from his shoulder. She noticed a split in his knuckles and a streak of gray dust across his cheek. "You didn't say you were heading out before dawn," she said, brushing the dust from her sleeves. "Didn't plan to," he replied, setting the pail down with a dull thud. "Vein looked different in the light yesterday. Thought I'd see if it held." She nodded toward his hand. "It cost you." He eyed the scrape without concern. The rock fought back. "Let me clean it." He hesitated, then sat on the stoop while she fetched the rag and carbolic. As she dabbed the streak of blood, he winced but didn't pull away. "You ever dig before?" he asked. "I sorted coal with my father when I was young," she said. "Not like this." He worked a company shaft near Trinidad. I handed him tools, helped him keep the ledgers straight when his eyes went. "You've got a steady hand." "I have to." He looked at her then, close and quiet. Her hands didn't tremble, not even when she tied the last of the cloth. "You want to see the claim?" he asked. She blinked. "You'd let me? It's yours now, same as mine." They rode out after breakfast, the sun already high enough to press sweat into the collars of their shirts. The mine sat nestled between two worn bluffs, a narrow mouth cut into the ochre rock. The claim was modest, barely a tunnel, with timbers bracing the entrance and a wheelbarrow rusting nearby. A bucket and pulley hung from a stout beam, creaking gently in the breeze. Bria stepped inside, boots crunching against shale. The air was cooler here, close and still. "Most men would have walked away from this," she said. "I did, once," Harlan replied from behind. "Left it for 2 years. Then I came back." "Why?" He leaned against the frame. "Didn't feel right quitting. There's silver in there. Just not enough to make a man rich, but enough to live." She ran her fingers along the tunnel wall where faint streaks of metal caught the light. "You didn't mention it in town. No one asks about what's out here anymore. They only remember the mine that failed. And now," he looked at her, eyes steady, "now I've got someone who doesn't scare easy. She turned, their breath mingling in the cool air. I didn't come here to mine. No, he said. But you stayed. They didn't speak on the way back. The silence between them had changed again, not hollow, not distant. It felt like something being built. She sat behind him on the mule, her arms resting lightly around his waist, and he didn't shift away. That evening, while she stirred beans over the stove, he brought in a bundle of canvas and laid it on the table. She raised an eyebrow. Found it rolled behind the cot, he said. Old surveyor's chart. Thought maybe we could mark where the next vein might go. She unrolled it carefully. The paper was brittle, but the ink held. Harlan fetched a stub of pencil, and they bent over the table together, shoulders brushing. What's this mark here? She asked, pointing to a faint circle near the base of a wash. Old shaft. Caved in before I got here. Might be worth checking. She nodded. We'll go tomorrow. He leaned back. You're not afraid of the work? No, she said. Not if I'm not alone. His gaze lingered, quiet and warm. You're not. She folded the chart and placed it in the drawer. Outside, the wind had settled. The air held the scent of mesquite and iron. She looked at the door, then back at him. I don't want to sleep out here alone tonight. He met her eyes, no question in his face. Then don't. She banked the fire, washed her hands, and turned down the cot. Harlan rolled out his bedroll near the stove and lay with his back to the wall, arms crossed behind his head. For a long while, neither of them moved. Outside, a coyote started to howl, low and distant. Bria exhaled softly. You think this land remembers everyone who's passed through it? She asked. No, he said, but it remembers who stays. She closed her eyes, the weight of his words settling deep. Tomorrow they would dig. Tomorrow they would walk the old shaft. But tonight there was quiet and warmth and something stronger than promise. Something earned. By the time the sun crested the ridge, Bria was already tying her hair back with a strip of linen, sleeves rolled to the elbow. The old shaft lay east through a dry arroyo, half swallowed by sand and mesquite. Harlan led the way, pack slung over his shoulder, a coil of rope and lantern clattering against his hip. They reached the collapsed entrance by mid-morning. The timbers had rotted through and sagged inward, leaving a crawl space barely wide enough for a man's shoulders. Won't be safe more than a few feet in, Harlan said, crouching to test the edge with a gloved hand. But if there's ore here, it'll be close to the surface. Bria knelt beside him, brushing away debris. I'll hold the lantern. You take the lead. He glanced at her hand on the handle, then nodded once and ducked inside. The passage narrowed quick, the air stale and thick with the scent of old earth. Bria kept close behind, the lantern's glow flickering across the walls. After a dozen paces, Harlan stopped, tapping his pick gently against a vein of dark mineral threading the stone. He ran a thumb across it. Soft. Could be argentite. Worth anything? Maybe. Needs testing. Bria angled the lantern higher. We'll need a cart, a sifter. He turned back, his expression unreadable in the half-light. You mean to work it with me? I didn't come all this way to sit idle, she said. They crawled out, sweat slicking their necks despite the cool of the shaft. Harlan stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. I'll reinforce the frame. We can dig deeper once it's braced. I can help cut beams. You ever used a crosscut saw? No, but I can learn. He studied her a moment, then nodded. Then we'll start tomorrow. That afternoon, Bria walked the outer rise alone, gathering dry branches for kindling. She paused near a stand of ocotillo, its spiny arms reaching skyward, and spotted a weathered grave marker half swallowed by dust. The name was long faded, but the cross was carved from mesquite and still stood. When she returned, Harlan was sharpening the blade of his hand saw on a whetstone. There's a grave out past the arroyo, she said, setting down her bundle. I know, he answered without looking up. Old miner. Never found out who. Do you think he came for silver? Maybe. Or maybe he just needed to disappear. Bria sat beside him, the whetstone's slow rasp filling the space between them. Did you? His hand stilled. After the war, I went west. Didn't know what I wanted. Just knew I couldn't go back. She didn't press. He finished sharpening and set the saw aside. You? He asked. I ran from something. Thought I was running toward something else. Turns out, I was just running. She reached for a strip of jerky from the tin on the table, chewing slowly. You stopped running now? He asked. I think I'm learning how to stay. That night, they ate by lantern fire, the wind soft against the door. Bria stitched a new hem into Harlan's worn work shirt, while he read aloud from a dog-eared geology manual, eyes narrowing as he studied the diagrams. I never learned to read properly, he admitted after a pause. I know enough for maps. Letters take longer. Bria looked up. I could help. He rubbed the back of his neck. You sure you want to? I'm sure. He nodded, and she turned the page for him, tracing her finger under each word as he sounded them out. The lantern hissed gently, casting their shadows long on the wall. In the days that followed, the shaft took shape. Bria learned to brace timbers, to read the gleam of or in the rock. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Harlan built a hoist from scrap iron and rope. They worked side by side without speaking much, but the silence had a rhythm now familiar, like the creak of the pulley or the scrape of shovel against stone. One morning, as they sifted through a fresh load of tailings, she held up a dull gray lump streaked with black. Is this anything? Harlan took it, turning it in his palm. Looks like galena. That's lead silver. That's good. She grinned and brushed her hands on her skirt. Enough to keep going? Enough to start smelting. They rode to Buckeye the next day, 30 miles north. It took them past dry riverbeds and into low sage country. Bria wore her best dress, the one with the small blue buttons down the back. Harlan had shaved, his jawline clean beneath the brim of his hat. The general store was quiet, the owner wary but welcoming. They bought crucibles, cordwood, and 2 sacks of flour. Harlan paid in coin and scrap metal. The clerk nodded toward Bria as they left. Your wife? He asked. Harlan paused. Not yet. She heard the words, but he didn't look at her when he said them. She didn't look away. They camped just off the road that night, a small fire crackling beneath the stars. Bria folded her arms around her knees, watching the sparks drift upward. Harlan leaned against a boulder, sharpening the tines of the shovel. You ever think about what's next? She asked. Next? After the shaft is steady. When we're pulling more than we can smelt in a week. He looked toward the hills. I'd build a second room, maybe a porch. You said once you liked morning light. She turned toward him. He met her eyes and said, quieter now, and I'd ask you to stay. Not because there's nowhere else to go, but because I'd want you to. Bria didn't answer at first. The fire cracked and settled. Then she picked up the spare blanket, crossed to where he sat, and laid it beside him. I want to, she said. They lay side by side, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth shared between them. Above them, the stars wheeled in silence. Below, the land held steady, waiting for what they'd build next. Bria pressed the last of the clay tight around the wide-lipped crucible, fingers stiff from the thin morning chill. Ash dusted her sleeves, fine and gray, rising from the coal bed beneath the smelting pit they had dug 2 days earlier. Harlan crouched beside her, feeding a slow burning flame through the base, a makeshift bellows tucked under one arm. The silver ore they had collected from the old shaft had been crushed and sifted, poured into the crucible with charcoal and soda ash. Now it waited, half submerged in fire, for the heat to do its slow work. They didn't speak. The fire demanded attention, and neither of them had patience for wasted words. When the sun crested the ridge, Bria stood and wiped her brow with the inside of her wrist. She watched Harlan adjust the draw on the bellows, his shoulders tight with concentration. Ever think you'd get this far with it? She asked. He didn't lift his eyes. Didn't think about it one way or the other. She turned toward the desert beyond the clearing. I did. He looked up then. You think in steps. I don't. She nodded once. That's why this works. The crucible glowed dull red and they leaned back, letting the heat settle and the fire hold. Bria fetched water from the barrel and passed him a tin cup. He drank without speaking, then handed it back. "I saw a hawk circling the ridge last night," she said. "Big one." He nodded. "They nest near the gulch. You thinking about hunting?" "No. Just watching." He wiped his hands on a rag. "You miss green country?" She considered. "Sometimes I miss the sound of rain on a roof. But not enough to leave." He didn't reply, but something eased in his stance. Hours later, when the silver cooled and the slag was stripped away, a single dull ingot sat heavy in Bria's palm. She turned it in the light, the metal smooth with promise. Harlan watched her, his expression unreadable. "We'll need more ore," she said. He nodded. "There's more, but deeper's harder." "I'm not afraid of harder." He took the ingot from her hand, set it carefully in the wooden box they kept for trade, and closed the lid. "Neither am I." The next day they made the long ride north again, this time with the box packed full of wrapped silver. At the smelter's yard in Buckeye, the assayer weighed the bars under a canvas awning, scribbling figures in a ledger with ink-stained hands. "Fair work," he muttered. "Refined proper. No scrap in it." Bria stood silent beside Harlan, her arms crossed, watching the man count out coin in a small leather pouch. Harlan didn't touch the money until the assayer nodded and walked off. Back at the mule, Bria pulled the pouch open, examined the coins, and closed it again. "We could buy a plow," she said. "Or seed. Start a garden." "There's no water for it," he said. "There might be. If we found the spring again." He looked sideways at her. "You're still thinking in steps." "I am." They camped that night just off the trail, fire low, sky full of wind. Harlan sat with his back against a boulder, hands resting over his knees. Bria laid out her blanket a pace away, boots off, skirt tucked beneath her legs. "You ever think about what you'd do if you weren't mining?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Then no one ever asked me that. I'm asking now." He looked at the fire, then up at her. "Maybe I'd build things. Something that lasts." "You already are." He didn't smile, but she saw the shift in his eyes. A softening. "You know there's a courthouse in Prescott," he said. "I do. They ask questions. I can answer them. They'll want to know why a man and a woman are filing a land deed together." She held his gaze. "Then we'll give them a reason." He stood, walked to the saddlebags, and pulled out a folded slip of paper. He sat back down and handed it to her. "Found this in the old shaft. Surveyor's mark. It proves the claim's worth something now." She traced the faded lines, the signature at the bottom, the stamp of the territorial office. "You want to file it together?" "I do." She looked up. The firelight drew the edges of his face in gold and shadow. The wind lifted her hair, and neither of them moved. "Then that's what we'll do," she said. He reached across the space between them and for the first time took her hand. His grip was solid, warm, roughened by work, but careful. They sat like that until the fire smoldered low, the stars wheeling overhead, the land stretching quiet and open around them. In the morning, they would ride. And when they returned, it would be as partners, on paper and in truth. The road to Prescott was rough with spring runoff, ruts deepened by wagon wheels and scattered with stones half hidden in the dust. Bria sat straight in the saddle, fingers wrapped firm around the reins, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Beside her, Harlan adjusted his hat against the morning glare, the courthouse papers tucked safely in the satchel strapped behind his saddle. Neither of them had spoken much since breaking camp, not out of silence, but because nothing needed saying. The decision was already made. At the edge of town, the scent of horses and cut pine filled the air. Prescott was broader than Gila Bend had ever been, its main street lined with brick storefronts and painted shutters. A blacksmith's hammer rang out from down the lane, and a boy chased a dog across the boardwalk, laughing. Bria's shoulders eased as they passed a woman in a straw bonnet selling early apples from a cart. "Does it feel strange?" she asked. Harlan glanced sideways. "Not strange. Just new." The land office stood off the square, a two-story building with a crooked flag above the door and a clerk who squinted through wire spectacles when they stepped inside. Behind him, shelves sagged under the weight of bound ledgers and stacked deeds. The clerk reached for a quill, blinking at the paper Harlan unfolded on the desk. Both your names? He asked, dipping into the inkwell. Bria nodded. Together. The clerk scratched their names across the form, then reached for the stamp. The thud of it hitting parchment echoed louder than it ought to have. Harlan slid the slip of paper back into the satchel and held it there a moment. Then he looked at Bria. You want to find the preacher? She drew in a breath. Yes, today. They found him 2 streets over, trimming a hedge beside a clapboard chapel with faded green paint curling off the eaves. He was a plain man with a sun-darkened face and hands still calloused from fieldwork. He asked no questions beyond their names and whether they had come of their own free choosing. They had. Inside, the chapel was empty but clean, the air heavy with dust and pine oil. Bria stood with her hands folded, her dress pressed smooth and her hair drawn back in a tight braid. Harlan stood beside her, shoulders squared the same way he stood at the mind steady and rooted. The preacher opened his Bible to a page near the center but barely looked at it as he spoke. Do you take each other freely without debt or promise owed to another? Bria answered first. I do. Harlan's voice followed, low and certain. I do. Outside, the wind caught the chapel's bell and sent it clanging once, sharp and clear. They left arm in arm, walking slow down the street with no need to speak. When they passed the general store, Bria paused. I'm going to need a needle with a finer point. If we're going to hang curtains. Harlan tilted his head. We? She met his eyes. You said you wanted a porch. I want a window that faces east. For mornings. Then we'll build both. They rode home over 2 days, taking the long path past the bluff to avoid a washout along the main trail. When they turned off the ridge and the shack came into view, Bria let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Smoke curled from the chimney left from the fire they'd banked before they left. The mule nickered as they reached the gate. Inside, the table still held the folded surveyor's map and the crucible sat empty beside the stove. Bria ran a hand over the plank wall, then turned to Harlan. I want to plant something. He set down the satchel. We'll need to dig a trench, lay a channel from the spring. It'll take time. She smiled. We've got time now. He stepped closer, fingers brushing hers, and she leaned into him not with urgency but with certainty. He kissed her slowly, the weight of it quiet and lasting. That night, they slept in the same bed for the first time. Not as strangers weathering hardship, not as partners in silver and soil, but as 2 people who had chosen day by day to build something that could not be bought or promised in a letter. They woke with their hands still joined, the pale light of dawn slipping through the slats above them. Weeks passed. The mine held steady, the shaft deepening with care. Harlan cut beams from a fallen juniper and laid the foundation for the porch by hand. Bria planted squash and beans in a square of soil they cleared behind the house, drawing water from the spring Harlan had uncovered beneath a tangle of brush. In the quiet hours, he read the ledgers Bria taught him to keep, his handwriting slow but sure. She mended his cuffs not because they needed it, but because she liked the feel of his shirt in her lap. One afternoon, a rider passed through an old friend of Harlan's from his soldiering days, heading west to California. He stayed one night, sleeping under the stars, and left with his canteen full and a promise to send seed from the valleys beyond the Sierra. Bria watched him ride off and turned to Harlan. You never told me you had friends. He shrugged. Didn't know I needed any, till now. As the year turned, the porch stood finished, the garden took root, and the shaft yielded enough silver to trade for a second mule and window glass. Bria sewed curtains from a bolt of cream calico and hung them herself, her hands no longer raw but strong. One morning in late autumn, she stood on the porch with a mug of chicory and watched the sun rise over the ridge. Harlan came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. He didn't speak at first. Then, I like it here. She tilted her head back against him. So do I. The wind rustled the dry mesquite, and somewhere nearby, a hawk cried once and was gone. They stayed like that until the sun cleared the hills. And when they stepped back inside, it was as husband and wife, as builders of a life not promised by fate or fortune, but made real by quiet work, shared strength, and the kind of love that never needed proving. They never left that land. They had no need. What they had built was enough, and it held.